History often turns on moments that pass in the span of a heartbeat, when two armies meet, and within an hour the fate of an entire region is rewritten. At Pydna, that's exactly what happened. A clash that looked, on paper, like just another battle became the spark that shifted the balance of the ancient Mediterranean. It was a showdown between two worlds, a Roman Republic rising in confidence and ambition, and a proud Macedonian kingdom trying to preserve the last ember of Alexander's legacy. What unfolded on that field would echo far beyond the dust and blood of a single afternoon. 30,000 Romans stood across from roughly 44,000 Macedonians at Pydna, and in less than an hour, the Macedonian line collapsed. Ancient writers often praise the Macedonian phalanx as an unbreakable wall of spears, but on that day it shattered under Roman pressure. Whether the old accounts exaggerated or not, the scale of the Roman triumph marked a decisive shift in Mediterranean power. By this time, Rome had already broken Carthage's back in the Punic Wars and had begun pushing aggressively into the eastern Mediterranean. That expansion inevitably brought them face to face with Macedonia, the last major stronghold of the Antigonid dynasty, which still traced its lineage to Alexander the Great himself. The once mighty Hellenistic world was now fractured, weakened, and constantly tugged at by larger powers. Even kingdoms like Pergamum and Rhodes, technically Roman allies, frequently begged Rome to keep Macedonia in line. Rome, stepping into the role of regional power broker, was more than eager to tighten its grip. Enter King Perseus of Macedonia, the ambitious son of Philip V. From the moment he took the throne in 179 BC, he made his intentions unmistakable. He would not bow to Rome. He immediately began courting Greek city-states, stirring up anti-Roman feeling, and even reached out to northern tribes to build a broader coalition. Some of his moves were audacious, marching troops to Delphi, expanding influence across Thrace and Illyria, and naturally these actions alarmed Rome's allies, especially Eumenes II of Pergamum. Eumenes delivered a fiery speech before the Roman Senate, accusing Perseus of preparing for war, a speech that helped ignite the Third Macedonian War. A Roman delegation warned Perseus to retreat or effectively surrender his independence. Perseus refused, and with that, Rome declared war. At first, the conflict drifted without major results. Rome won a few small engagements, but they were dealt a painful blow in 171 BC at the Battle of Callinicus, where Perseus' cavalry routed a Roman force. That victory lifted Perseus' prestige across the region. After that, the war froze into a tense deadlock. Perseus had taken up an extraordinarily strong defensive line along the Elpius River. The river formed a natural barrier, slowing and exposing any army trying to cross it. Steep hills and narrow passes allowed the Macedonians to funnel attackers into predictable choke points where maneuvering was impossible. Behind these defenses stood the Macedonian phalanx, bristling with sarissas, those impossibly long spears forming a forest of points that few armies ever dared to challenge head-on. For the Romans, this position was a tactical nightmare. Their manipular system excelled in mobility, rotating units, exploiting openings, adapting fluidly, but here, every advantage evaporated. A frontal assault would have meant bottlenecking into enemy fire and slamming directly into a spear wall, while Macedonian missile troops rained death from the heights. Roman commanders hesitated, and for nearly 2 years, the war stalled. The Senate grew increasingly impatient, demanding a breakthrough. But the Roman generals on the ground refused to throw their legions into a hopeless slaughter. That was when Rome called in a new commander, Lucius Aemilius Paulus. His assignment was simple: end the war. Rome's philosophy of war differed sharply from that of the Greek states. Greeks often entertained diplomacy and negotiation. Rome tolerated none of it. Their rule was absolute: total victory or total defeat, nothing in between. Paulus embodied that mindset. He was a seasoned consul known for discipline and prudence, for personally drilling his troops, and for his measured judgment. He combined tactical intelligence with psychological insight, forcing his enemies into battles on his terms. His solution was to unseat Perseus from the supposedly unassailable position on the Elpius. But rather than repeating the earlier Roman mistake of charging directly at the defenses, Paulus devised a clever stratagem. He sent a detachment under Publius Cornelius Scipio Nasica Corculum along the coast on a flanking mission. A Roman deserter warned Perseus of the move, prompting the Macedonian king to dispatch a large force to block the approach, exactly what Paulus wanted. The maneuver forced Perseus to abandon his fortified line and withdraw north to Pydna to protect his supply routes. Suddenly, Perseus found himself compelled to fight on open ground, a battlefield far less suited to his army's rigid formations. Paulus had chosen the terrain near Pydna with precision. The ground was uneven, broken, and unpredictable, conditions that devastated the cohesion of a tightly packed phalanx. Those long sarissas needed flat land to maintain a unified front. Even slight unevenness could disrupt their perfect alignment, creating tiny cracks that the Romans were experts at exploiting. Meanwhile, the Roman manipular legions thrived in such terrain, free to maneuver, rotate, and adapt. This wasn't just a tactical victory, it was psychological warfare. Paulus forced Perseus out of safety and into a battlefield crafted specifically to undermine the Macedonian advantage. It was a trap disguised as necessity. Perseus had no choice but to defend his supply lines, and by doing so, he walked straight onto the field Rome wanted. This was the Roman way of war at its finest: adaptability, cunning, and relentless pressure. Paulus demonstrated all of it at Pydna, orchestrating the perfect setup for his legionaries. But preparing the battlefield was only the first step. The real test was yet to come. The Battle of Pydna is often remembered as the defining confrontation between two of the ancient world's most formidable military systems. On one side stood Rome's flexible manipular legions, units built on adaptability, rotation, and relentless discipline. Opposing them was the legendary Macedonian Phalanx, a formation that for centuries had been regarded as the pinnacle of infantry warfare. When these two doctrines finally collided in earnest, the battlefield became a laboratory of military theory, revealing not only the strengths of each system, but also the hidden vulnerabilities that could bring even the greatest armies to ruin. For generations, the Macedonian Phalanx had been the golden standard of Hellenistic warfare. Conceived by Philip II and brought to near-mythical perfection by Alexander the Great, it had carved empires across continents. It wasn't simply a formation, it was a symbol, the iron heartbeat of Macedonian pride. Its achievements shaped military strategy across the Mediterranean, and armies far beyond Greece attempted to imitate its structure. At its core, the Phalanx was a masterpiece of coordination. A syntagma of 256 men, arranged 16 ranks deep, functioned as a single living organism. Soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, their lives bound together by discipline, trust, and a shared rhythm of movement. The formation was designed for forward momentum and crushing offensive power. When its lines advanced in unison, with countless sarissas projecting outward like the quills of an enormous iron beast, almost nothing in the ancient world could withstand its charge. The sarissa, the phalanx's defining weapon, was a marvel of battlefield engineering, stretching anywhere from 13 to 20 feet during Alexander's era, and even longer in later Hellenistic armies. It demanded both hands to control. The men carried only a small shield hung from the neck, trading personal protection for the overwhelming reach needed to dominate the battlefield. Several ranks could lower their spears at once, creating a multi-tiered spear wall bristling with deadly points. Traditional hoplite formations crumbled before it. Light infantry could not approach it. Even cavalry hesitated to challenge it head-on. Yet the sarissa also carried within it the seeds of the phalanx's undoing. Its sheer size made close combat nearly impossible. Once enemies slipped under the spear points, the phalangites were nearly defenseless. Their small shield was a poor match for heavier Roman armor, and their shorter sword were awkward compared to the Roman gladius. The very density that gave the phalanx its power robbed it of agility, turning the formation, Adjusting to uneven terrain or reacting quickly to unexpected threats required an almost impossibly high level of coordination. A slight break in alignment, a ditch, a rock, or a patch of uneven ground could ripple backward through the ranks and throw the entire unit into confusion. Macedonian doctrine relied heavily on a precise formula. The phalanx acted as the anvil, pinning the enemy in place, while heavy cavalry swept around the flanks to deliver the decisive blow. When this coordination worked flawlessly, the effect was devastating, creating a hammer-and-anvil trap that crushed opposing armies. But when conditions were less than perfect, when the terrain was difficult, when visibility was limited, or when the enemy refused to meet the phalanx on its own terms, the entire machine could seize up. Rome, meanwhile, approached warfare from an entirely different philosophical angle. Rather than relying on a single, specialized formation, the Romans invested in flexibility. Their manipular system was decentralized, adaptable, and built for movement. Commanders emphasized training, standardization, and, crucially, learning from every enemy they encountered. The legions evolved constantly, absorbing lessons from Samnites, Etruscans, Greeks, and Gauls. Their army became a collection of practical improvements, refined through centuries of trial and error. A Roman legion was divided into maniples of roughly 120 men arranged in a checkerboard pattern, allowing units to move independently while still supporting one another. This structure let commanders respond instantly to terrain changes or sudden threats, an enormous advantage over armies locked into rigid formations. Their equipment complemented this approach perfectly. The pilum, a heavy throwing spear, was designed to disrupt enemy shields and break formations just before the lines met. The scutum, large and curved, offered protection and offensive strength. Legionaries used it to shove, create space, and fracture enemy cohesion. And once they closed the distance, the gladius, short, sharp, and ideal for stabbing, became devastating, allowing Roman soldiers to fight effectively in tight spaces where longer weapons were useless. But perhaps their greatest strength was their culture of discipline and organization. Even during brief halts, legionaries constructed fortified camps with near-mechanical precision. Their chain of command empowered officers at every level to make quick decisions, giving the Romans a level of battlefield flexibility unmatched in the ancient world. The two armies that assembled at Pydna embodied these competing philosophies. Rome fielded between 29,000 and 38,000 soldiers, a blend of legionaries, Italian allies, and auxiliary troops, with roughly 3,400 cavalry. Paulus also had an unexpected advantage: 22 war elephants provided by African allies, stationed strategically to protect the Roman right. His formation was arranged with precision. 2 legions in the center, allies holding the wings, cavalry on both flanks, and the elephants ready to disrupt any Macedonian charge. Opposite them stood a force of 40,000 to 44,000 Macedonians, the last great army of a once dominant Hellenistic empire. At its core towered the Phalanx, joined by mercenaries, light infantry, and Thracian warriors guarding the flanks. On the right, Perseus himself commanded the elite heavy cavalry, including the famed Sacred Squadron. On the left, an elite corps of 3,000 infantry anchored the line, supporting the massive phalanx. Just watching the two armies prepare for battle revealed the tension of the moment. Every soldier understood that this would not be a minor skirmish or a simple border dispute. It was a clash of identities, two military cultures, two worldviews, two empires in the making meeting on a field that would determine the fate of the Mediterranean. When the Macedonian phalanx began its initial advance at Pydna, it moved with such precision and terrifying unity that even seasoned Roman officers felt a chill. Ancient authors describe Lucius Aemilius Paulus watching its approach in a mixture of awe and dread. Before him rolled a formation so tightly packed, so mathematically aligned, that it resembled a giant living creature. Thousands of sarissas thrust forward at the same angle, catching the sun and glinting like a single sheet of silver. The soldiers marched almost elbow-locked, each man trusting the formation more than his own shield. The first collision was explosive. The Phalanx struck the Roman line with overwhelming force, driving back entire cohorts through sheer pressure. The ground trembled under the push of thousands of synchronized steps. Some of Rome's allied troops, less disciplined and positioned on the edges, felt that unstoppable momentum and broke ranks, throwing down their shields as they ran. For a few tense moments, it appeared that Macedonia's ancient weapon of empire would once again steamroll anything in its path. But Paulus understood something many commanders before him had not. The Phalanx was powerful only if it fought on its terms. So instead of ordering his men to stand and endure the crush, he directed a controlled withdrawal. The Romans fell back in disciplined layers, intentionally giving the Phalanx space and unknowingly luring it into the trap Paulus had been setting since the day he chose the field. The terrain near Pydna was deceptive. From afar it looked open, but in reality the landscape was broken by subtle ridges, small ravines, and uneven rises that could not be seen until one marched directly over them. As the Macedonian soldiers pressed forward, their once perfect formation began to warp. The rigid geometry that made the Phalanx terrifying on flat plains now betrayed it. Ranks began to drift out of alignment, some stepping higher, others sinking lower, slight mismatches causing the sarissas to wobble and lose their deadly uniformity. Paulus, always watching for the slightest shift, recognized the moment the formation's integrity faltered. With the decisiveness of a man who had been waiting for this exact weakness, he ordered the counterattack. This was the Romans' arena. Their entire military system, equipment, training, doctrine thrived in close-range, chaotic combat. The legionaries rushed into the widening gaps, locking behind their great scuta shields. In such tight quarters, the Macedonian sarissa became dead weight, far too long to aim, retract, or brace. Phalangites suddenly found themselves unable to defend their sides, or even turn their weapons fast enough to meet the Roman charge. Inside those fractures, the gladius became the true star of the battlefield. It was short, sharp, and designed to kill quickly. Roman soldiers thrust into unprotected thighs, stomachs, and throats. They slammed their scuta forward to break balance, then stabbed again with uncanny precision. The Macedonian pelt shield, small, neck-slung, and originally meant only to help brace the spear, offered little more protection than a dinner tray. The Romans fought with the confidence of men who knew the terrain, and the situation now favored them completely. The manipular formation showed its brilliance here. Each maniple functioned almost like a squad of hunters moving through dense brush, pivoting, flanking, and responding to opportunities instantly. Some maniples slipped behind the Macedonian line, slicing into the Phalanx's exposed rear. Others, seeing the sarissas tangled or lifted awkwardly on the uneven slopes, charged head-on with a roar, breaking the remaining cohesion. Within minutes, the meticulously constructed engine of Macedonian warfare became a collection of isolated pockets desperately trying to survive. And the psychological damage was immediate. The Phalanx depended on unity. Once that unity collapsed, soldiers felt naked and out of place. They had trained their entire lives to fight in a single, impenetrable block, never as individuals. Now, surrounded on all sides, they fought terrified and alone. In less than an hour, the unstoppable advance had turned into a chaotic rout. The Phalanx, symbol of Macedonian identity, inheritance of Alexander's golden age, was being butchered in the hills of Pydna. Yet the battle's collapse was not due solely to terrain. It was also the failure of Macedonian leadership. Traditional Macedonian strategy relied on the hammer and anvil doctrine. The Phalanx pinned the enemy in place, and the heavy cavalry delivered the decisive blow from the flanks. But at Pydna, the cavalry remained shockingly inactive. Some historians argue that Macedonian nobles despised Perseus and refused to commit themselves fully. Others believe Perseus hesitated, overwhelmed by the speed at which the situation deteriorated. The result, however, was disastrous. The Phalanx, the anvil, had no hammer to support it. And then came Perseus's defining moment of failure. As the Phalanx began to disintegrate, the king fled with his cavalry, escaping almost unscathed while his infantry was slaughtered. To the men dying on the field, this was unforgivable. Ancient writers describe survivors spitting the word coward when speaking of him. The army didn't lose because it was old-fashioned. It lost because the man who was supposed to lead it surrendered his courage. The lesson of Pydna is harsh but clear. Even the greatest military machine collapses when its leader breaks. Rome, meanwhile, displayed not only tactical brilliance, but psychological mastery. Roman pila shattered shields and spirit alike. Standards hurled forward created focal points of frenzy. Trumpeters and officers barked coordinated commands that amplified Roman confidence and amplified Macedonian fear. War for the Romans was won as much in the mind as in the melee. The final toll was staggering. Between 20,000 and 25,000 Macedonians were killed. Roman losses barely reached 1,000. The scale of the slaughter effectively ended Macedonia's independence forever. Rome's victory did not end at the battlefield. It continued in the political theater that followed. Determined to prevent any resurgence, Rome meticulously dismantled the Macedonian kingdom. They did not simply annex it. They carved it into 4 client republics, each forbidden to intermarry, trade land, or form political alliances with the others. It was a calculated act of suffocation. Divide the limbs so the body can never stand again. For Perseus, the humiliation was complete. He was paraded in chains through the streets of Rome during Aemilius Paulus's triumph, a living symbol of the Antigonid dynasty's downfall. A descendant of Alexander the Great, reduced to an exhibit in another nation's celebration. He died in captivity, remembered not as a king, but as a warning. The riches Rome seized from Macedonia were so immense that in 167 BC, the Roman government abolished direct taxes for its citizens. For the first time in history, a state could run itself entirely on war spoils. It was a new kind of empire, one that grew richer the farther it expanded, turning conquest into an economic engine. And so, Pydna stands as more than a battle. It marks the death of the Hellenistic age's last serious challenger and the rise of a Rome that would dominate the Mediterranean world for centuries. It is the clearest example of how adaptability defeats rigidity, how leadership matters more than tradition, and how a single hour on a rugged field can change the course of history. Pydna was not simply a Roman victory. It was the moment the ancient world learned what crossing Rome truly meant. Total defeat, total humiliation, total transformation of the balance of power.